Hi, my name is Sarah Harper, and I will be presenting the Royal Proclamation 2022 Wampum Belt design on behalf of our firm. I'd first like to thank you for making the time to hear an explanation for the Wampum Belt and give a land acknowledgement as I am currently in the city of Windsor, Ontario, and am sitting on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, comprised of the Odawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe peoples. In this explanation, I will go over in depth the design and the purpose of the 2022 Wampum Belt, as well as pressing issues that need to be addressed. The overall purpose and goal of the Wampum Belt is to take steps forward towards reconciliation between Canada and Indigenous peoples. The Canadian legal system has been used as a tool in suppressing and denying Indigenous laws, making the Canadian legal system the default in authority when resolving legal issues impacting Indigenous communities and nations. Parliament has also not fully acknowledged wampum belts associated with treaties in the past. The creation of this belt is the act of Parliament beginning to recognize not only past wampum belts, but the validity of Indigenous laws and title. Some issues that also need to be addressed as they are inconsistent with the spirit of reconciliation. These issues are how the Canadian government approaches issues concerning the environment, the fact that the Prime Minister has yet to address the harm caused by residential schools, and finally, how law enforcement and legislative systems of Canada continue to be racist towards Indigenous peoples. The wampum belt we created consists of a purple background, the year 2022, 2 rows of white shells, and 3 important symbols. In creating the belt, our group wanted to encompass ideas and symbols we believe signify reconciliation between Canada and Indigenous peoples. The 3 symbols that can be seen on the belt, starting from the left, are a pine tree, a raven, and a butterfly. Beginning with the pine tree is a representation of the environment, as we want to acknowledge Indigenous connections with nature and living things. It is important moving forward to be more respectful of Indigenous relations to land and nature and how they are essential to the history, laws, and traditions. Indigenous nations have a long history of respecting and creating relationships with the land, nature, and animals. Their relationship and view with the environment around them is different from the Canadian westernized law, which is why Indigenous laws should be equal to Canadian law. For example, in Canada, contracts and agreements are only recognized as something between 2 people, while Indigenous nations can make agreements between themselves and nature or animals. Recognizing these agreements as well as honoring them is an important step towards reconciliation. Another example of why Indigenous laws and traditions need to be more recognized is in regards to property and land. In Canada, leaders and the government in the past and present times have used their power in the Canadian legal system to entrench on Indigenous land and rights, such as logging leading to deforestation, polluting waters, and allowing land to be torn up for pipelines. In regards to water pollution, many Indigenous people do not feel safe or comfortable drinking water as it takes a part in harming the land. This has created a separation in their relationship with their environment. Through property law, the government has restricted access to traditional lands, which has made hunting and access to essential parts of nature, such as gathering specific plants for medicine, more difficult. Moving forward, Indigenous nations should be given more authority in environmental protection and decisions. We propose a few Indigenous individuals be a part of an environmental protection board. The second symbol, seen in the middle of the belt, is the raven, which represents knowledge and the implementation of the 2-eyed seeing philosophy. To move forward towards reconciliation, the strengths of both Indigenous and Western knowledge and ways of knowing should be utilized. The purpose of the 2-eyed seeing philosophy is not to integrate them both together, but to recognize them as equals. This is also represented in the 2 lines running parallel on the belt, with one line representing the Indigenous ways and the other as Western ways. Currently, Westernized knowledge and laws are given automatic authority in Canada, and Indigenous knowledge and laws seem to just fit in as long as they do not conflict with Canadian laws. Indigenous nations should be given equal authority, such as establishing courts that deal specifically with Indigenous issues, rather than having Indigenous issues solved by Canadian courts where the same values are not established or recognized. These courts should be established and ran primarily by individuals in the community. The final symbol is the butterfly, which represents the change needed in Canadian's legal system. We acknowledge the best way to reach reconciliation is to recognize past harm in Canada has caused, and the way the legal system has been used to cause these harms, such as being wrongfully targeted by police, Indigenous people being overrepresented in incarceration institutions, the implementation of residential schools, and the overall discrimination and unfairness seen through the justice system. Acknowledging these acts of harm will help in addressing what changes are needed. There are many stories of Indigenous individuals, their families, and their communities being failed by the Canadian legal system. One example is Colton Bushy's story that only happened a few years ago, where the entire trial process was documented and captured the racism and inequalities Indigenous individuals face. Some examples were Indigenous jury members were targeted and dismissed immediately. Indigenous witnesses were being treated as if they were the accused. And the topic of racism is involved was not even allowed in the courtroom. The trial was unfair from the beginning due to the inequality and racism that is bound in the current Canadian justice system. In the documentary covering Colton's story, they also met with many leaders to tell their story, but no action was taken. These leaders listened to the family, but failed them by not taking any action or even committing to any action to prevent any further racism in the legal system. Colton's story should be what our current leaders in Canada should analyze and take steps to make sure that this does not repeat in another family or community. Courts should be required to acknowledge racism when it is relevant, as well as the impact of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius can have in courts when someone who is Indigenous is involved. Indigenous individuals should also be given more opportunities to join police forces and participate in the enforcement of the legal system, such as opportunities to become lawyers. In conclusion, the Royal Proclamation 2022 Wampum Belt design should be used as a tool for the government and the Prime Minister to take steps towards reconciliation towards Indigenous people. We hope these steps are implemented immediately, as these are present issues that concern the safety of Indigenous communities. I have highlighted all the symbols in the belt and the main issues they address involving the environment, equality and knowledge systems, and the important changes required in the legal system. I would like to thank you again for your time listening to my explanation of the Wampum Belt, and hope you were able to take away key concepts and issues that Parliament needs to address. If you have any further questions about the 2022 Wampum Belt, feel free to contact our firm, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.